Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Brussels Bureau Chief of Financial Times, Henry Foy.
Hey. Thank you. Hello, everyone. As the voice of God just told you, I am Henry. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks to GMF for having me. It's a real pleasure, though, to be in charge of this session. I'm sorry I will be stood up like this the whole time. Hope that's not too distracting. With a live conversation from Washington. We are very, very fortunate to have joining us Senator Chris Murphy. The Democratic senator from Connecticut is one of the most vociferous critics of Russia on the Hill and biggest supporters of Ukraine. And such is the perfect time to be talking to him. And we can see you now, Senator. Perfect. You're talking to a room full of transatlantic nerds, I would say, and most of them Europeans who are obviously following every twist and turn from the Hill over the last few days. So I'll start with the question everyone's asking. In your opinion, how likely is it that the supplemental will get done this weekend?
It will get done this weekend. And I'm very pleased and relieved that the House of Representatives has finally decided to move forward on a bill that not only funds Ukraine, interestingly, at a number that appears to be slightly higher than the number in the Senate bill that passed a few months ago, but also includes funding for Israel and humanitarian assistance. There was some worry that the Senate bill, which included $9 billion in humanitarian assistance for Gaza, Africa, Sudan, other parts of the world, would be minimized or weakened in the House. And the end product that is coming from the House includes the full amount of humanitarian assistance that was in the Senate bill. Democrats last night, or actually early this morning, I believe, took an unprecedented step when the House approves a rule for debate. By tradition, it is only members of the majority party that supply the votes for that rule. But Democrats decided to join with Republicans in approving a rule for consideration of the supplemental package. That is a broader signal, I believe, that Democrats and Republicans are going to join together not only on final passage, which will happen Saturday early afternoon, but also will likely join together in protecting Speaker Johnson. If there's a motion to vacate, it will be Democrats ultimately who will have to provide the votes to keep him as Speaker. My guess is that if that contest comes and if this bill passes tomorrow, Democrats in the House are prepared to support the Speaker. That's obviously completely unprecedented situation, but it speaks to, frankly, the bipartisan commitment that we have to break precedent, to break tradition, in order to do the right thing for the world and Ukraine. The Senate may take that bill up immediately. We are staying in session through the weekend. We may wait until after the Passover holiday, but I feel more confident than ever that we are going to get this done and that it is going to have enough funding for Ukraine to get them through the entirety of this year and through much of next year. We'll see what this election brings.
That's obviously fantastic news. Do you see this, Senator, as a shift at the end of months and months of uncertainty and a new bipartisan deal going forward on future support? Or do you think this is a one-off and the next time will require the same level of effort and infighting?
Well, this allows this entire discussion to be pushed to the election. I mean, listen, the American people have a decision to make. Are they going to stand up for global security? Do they believe that Ukraine's security is directly tied to American security, as the majority of the House and the Senate believe? Or are they going to elect Trump, who I think has very clearly communicated that if he's president, he is not going to support legislation that will continue to defend Ukraine against Russia? So what this bill does is allows us to take this question to November. My belief is that the American people understand that we're better off spending a little bit of money to support Ukraine's sovereignty rather than getting to a point where we have American men and women dying in a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia inside Europe or inside the NATO alliance.
Here in Brussels, the slow process of getting this bill passed has really lit a fire under the Europeans to take some decisions quite quickly on financial aid, but also on military aid. Are you at all concerned that the passage of this bill in DC will see a bit of that pressure taken off the Europeans? How do you make sure that it's not seen as like, oh, okay, the Americans are doing their job, we can kind of sit back a bit now?
Well, I hope it does not. Obviously, we are passing this bill on a knife edge.
Yeah.
I think I'm right in expressing confidence that we will get this done over the weekend. But you all read the polls just as carefully as we do. You know that right now, Donald Trump and Joe Biden are locked in a dead heat. And let's just be clear: if Donald Trump wins, I hope he does not, but if he wins, I don't think there's any way for us to continue support for Ukraine. So Europe has to be in a position to do more, pick up all of or a serious percentage of the burden, depending on what happens in the upcoming American election.
Are you encouraged what you've seen from Europe in the last few months stepping up?
Well, I have, and I think it's really vital for both Europe and the United States to be able to address some of the real flaws in defense supply chains that have been exposed. I think there are some basic capabilities, certainly ammunition and artillery shells at the top of the list, in which there has to be significant duplicative capability between the United States and Europe. There are other more specialized technologies that I think it would be unwise for us to duplicate. But when it comes to the bread and butter of trench warfare, I think both the United States and Europe have to have the ability to supply allies in need, given that what we're seeing is that this isolationist strain that exists both in the United States and Europe can, for periods of time, dominate national politics. So there is going to be no certainty for the next 5 to 10 years that the United States and Europe will be in lockstep surrounding questions to support key allies like Ukraine.
There's obviously, as you're aware, a push in Europe at the moment to sort of stand on its own 2 feet, as it were, in terms of defense. There's a defense industrial strategy coming out of the Commission at some point being finalized. How do you see this going forward? I mean, is it capable to have, okay, the Europeans doing more and more by themselves, but also strengthening the US and EU defense collaboration?
Oh, absolutely. I think both of these things can happen at once. And as I mentioned, I think that there are some lower technology, bread and butter defense capabilities that we both likely need to be able to produce. But when it comes to more sensitive technology, when it comes to AI or space or more complicated missile defense technology, I think those are places in which we can continue to essentially split the responsibility and burden. But I'm amongst those in the United States that cheers Europe when they stand up and continue to build their defense industrial base and their ability to defend themselves. I frankly think that Americans are questioning the alliance when we continue to grow our defense budget by leaps and bounds, and we see only a handful of our allies in Europe doing the same. The more that Europe is investing in its industrial base, the more easy it is going to be to sell the continued participation in NATO to American voters who are right now in an open conversation as to whether this is still worth it.
In the debates around here, you hear a lot of officials quoting this 80% number, that in the last 2 years, 80% of defense spending has been on kit that's been bought from outside of the EU, and the absolute majority of that's come from the US. That's not a great thing, right, for Americans if Europeans are going to buy less and less from America and develop their own technologies? How do you make sure that that doesn't become a point of irritation?
Well, I think this then links into this broader conversation we have to have about how we each protect and build up our industrial base. Obviously, in the United States today, we are having a very serious conversation for the first time in a very long time about industrial policy. We have unnecessarily and dangerously gutted our industrial capacity. It is in part what has caused politics to become so frayed and unstable, because America is just not willing to become a country dependent only on financial and service sector jobs. Now, that is going to cause all sorts of friction and tension with Europe, because it means we are going to be more protectionist in the next 30 years about defense technology, about green technology, about AI. about microchips and semiconductors. So we've got to fold in this conversation about Europe deciding to do more in defense alongside America's decision to create more domestic content protections for non-defense industries. We've got to be able to coexist in a world in which both Europe and the United States are going to have desires across a multiplicity of industries to produce more at home.
And there's a big debate going on here, of course, over that defense industrial strategy. You have countries led by France that want it to be much more restrictive on the really, really good high-tech stuff just on Europe, and others that want it to be more open. And there's a feeling here that sort of the Inflation Reduction Act was sort of a bit of kick in the teeth for the Europeans from the Americans, so maybe they should make the industrial strategy a little bit less open to the Americans. I mean, how do you make sure that you're still part of that conversation?
Listen, I think there's going to be, especially when it comes to renewable energy and our quest to combat climate change, some friction. I don't shed tears that the United States decided after 30 years of talking to finally act when it comes to greening our economy. And it's sad that we can't always do that in coordination with Europe, but our politics are our politics. We had a brief moment in time in which we could pass that legislation, and by necessity, we were going to do it without deep coordination with our European allies. So I think, especially when it comes to our investment in clean technologies, we should accept a bit of friction as the price to pay for the urgency we have in acting to try to combat climate change.
We're all going to be heading to where you are, or most of us, in July for the NATO summit. What are your personal hopes and expectations from that?
Well, first, it's an opportunity to sell the alliance to the American people. I don't think we should be ashamed to use this as a PR opportunity. It's going to happen in the middle of a presidential election in which one candidate is going to be unabashedly talking about withdrawing from NATO or weakening our commitment to NATO, and the other candidate, President Joe Biden, is going to be explaining why NATO and the transatlantic alliance is vital. And so this is a moment for Europe to come to Washington and really explain how committed they are and how they are beginning to build up capabilities that maybe they had relied on the United States on for far too long. I think, second, I do want to be careful about not having too big and too outsized expectations for Ukraine at this point. This is going to be a moment to celebrate the fact that after some deep questioning of whether the United States and Europe is going to be there for the United States, we will be able to talk about a multi-year new commitment, having this bill having passed only a month or so before the summit. But at the same time, we don't think there is going to be a massive leap forward on Ukraine's participation in NATO. I don't expect there to be an invitation, but that shouldn't sour the mood, especially given the fact that we are going to be convening at a moment where both Europe and the United States have made this big new long-term commitment to Ukraine's defense.
But this is going to be happening at a time of acute danger for Ukraine in the summer. Surely that is the moment to really push the boat out and try to maximize the amount of outcomes from NATO, from that summit for Ukraine, at a moment when they're most in need.
Which is why I think this is an important moment to sell to the American people that NATO is still viable and relevant to protecting U.S. interests, not just Ukrainian interests. If NATO is going to be there for Ukraine in the long run, then the United States can't be constantly on a knife edge as to whether we're going to provide this support. So that's why I say we shouldn't be afraid of viewing this summit first and foremost as an opportunity to explain to the American public why we need to be committed to this alliance and committed to Ukraine.
Keen to take some questions from the audience, but just to pivot to another topic before then, China. How do you see US-EU cooperation in terms of having a united front vis-a-vis Beijing?
Well, listen, I think that the most important question for the next 50 years is how well and how seamlessly the United States and Europe work together to manage China's rise, and whether we can build more robust and more meaningful cooperation with democracies in Asia, in particular India, on that set of work. There is just no question what China is trying to do. China is in the process of trying to buy up the pumping of the global economy. whether it be high-speed data connection, port infrastructure, critical mineral supply. And right now, they are lapping us because A, Europe and the United States have simply not committed the kind of resources necessary to compete with China when it comes to purchases and tenders of that infrastructure. And B, we are not working well enough and closely enough together. We are in a very dangerous discussion in the United States about essentially conceding that we will not have enough development finance for the next 10 to 20 years to compete with China. And so we are going to adjust our Middle East strategy in order to convince the Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia, to act as our development bank to try to manage that of China. That compromises our national security, and it would just be better if the two richest economies in the world, the United States and Europe, decided to put up the necessary amount to be able to compete square with China when it comes to this competition for the global economic piping.
What do you think the administration in the US needs to do to convince the Europeans to hew closer to the US line on China? I mean, what else can be done to put pressure on the Europeans to follow suit?
Well, I think we need to work together on building capacities that right now we rely upon China for. I'm very proud of the CHIPS Act. I do think it's absolutely essential that we onshore the ability to make that absolutely critical technology. But of course, it would be better off to be in a conversation with Europe about doing that together and deciding whether or not we need to rebuild every critical technology inside the United States or whether we can share that burden with Europe. Let's take medicines, for example. I just think it's a massive exposure for both of our economies to be dependent on China for the production and manufacture of critical medicines. But we don't have the capacity to make all of the most important medical technologies and medicines in the United States. We should be able to share that with Europe. We should maybe be in a position where we can share cross-subsidy with Europe to try to build up those industries. That's a difficult, complicated, complex conversation to have, but I think it's necessary.
Those two conversations that we've had, though, are sort of part of the same coin, though, aren't they? You're saying, on the one hand, we want Europe to sort of stand on its own 2 feet more, to be more autonomous in terms of defense and be able to take care of itself. But on the other hand, it's sort of chafing a bit that they have a very different foreign policy on China. How do you make sure those two things don't get pulled apart, right? If you're saying, please stand on your own 2 feet, but also stick with us on these key issues.
Well, listen, what I'm saying is that on the specific question of selling NATO to the American public, I think it's important for them to see Europe do more. That's a political question. Of course, I would like for that to be as best integrated with the decisions we're making about investing in our own defense infrastructure. I'm simply acknowledging that you're not going to get this coordination question right all the time. But if the United States is making more offers to work with Europe, which I understand is difficult, when Europe looks at the 2024 election and thinks to themselves, well, why would I invest all of this time in economic and industrial capacity coordination if Donald Trump is going to get elected and unwind it all? I know that's a very difficult conversation, but I still think that making those offers, even if we're not going to be perfect in executing on the work, is maybe part of what gives Europe a little bit more confidence to be more integrated with us, less integrated with China.
I'll go to the audience next, but just you mentioned Mr. Trump. What's the one thing Europe can do to try to Trump-proof itself, if indeed that is the outcome?
Well, and let me just say one more thing about what needs to happen in order for the United States and Europe to work more functionally. I mean, I think Europe just has to decide exactly when it's speaking with one voice and when it is not. It's obviously very confusing for the United States to engage with Europe when there continues to be an iterative conversation about what the degree of political coordination is. There does seem to be a new plan being floated every 12 months or so on exactly how Europe is going to speak with one voice on matters of international policy or national security. And I don't think that's helpful for our transatlantic alliance. I mean, listen, how do we Trump-proof the alliance? You beat Donald Trump. I mean, I don't think that I think you just have to understand what the second Trump administration looks like. It is an absolute disaster for Europe, just a disaster. Because for most of the first Trump administration, you still had people surrounding him, like General Mattis, like Henry McMaster, like General Kelly, frankly, even like Ivanka Trump, who maybe had helpful things to say in order to mitigate his worst instincts about what to do with the alliance. Those people will not be there. They will not ever be allowed in the Oval Office in Trump's second term. It's going to be Michael Flynn and Steve Bannon who will be making policy. And I think that speaks to a potential fundamental disruption between the United States and Europe, and speaks to the only option needing to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't win. I hate to be overtly political at a policy conference, but that is just the reality. And I think it would be a mistake to delude ourselves into thinking that someone to protect the transatlantic alliance from a second Trump term, which is going to be populated by a bunch of really dangerous racist nationalists.
Sadly, we don't have a vote, so we can't help you beat him, but good luck. Questions from the audience. We have microphones floating around. If you could introduce yourself and keep the questions short and pithy. Thank you.
Yes, hello. My name is Igor Berlan. I'm a Ukrainian journalist. I work at Detector Media. Senator Turner, thank you very much for this discussion. And I have a question about the absence of the US strategy towards Russia. And when can we expect the strategy about containment of Russia and as a vital part of Ukraine's victory in this war? Thank you.
Well, one of the things I think it's really important for us to do a better job of is calculating the ways that we work together on containing Russia's malevolent activity in and around its periphery. Yes, I want European countries, members of NATO, to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. But I think it is an unhelpful way to calculate the means by which we fight back against Russia's attempts to try to influence politics in Europe, in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, and occasionally Russia's attempts to actually overthrow governments in those places, as they did a few years ago in Montenegro. Many European nations are spending significant amounts of money on ending their energy dependence on Russia, or building up new tools to combat misinformation and propaganda emanating from Russia. Those expenditures are frankly just as important, if not more important, than military expenditures. I'm sick over the fact that the United States spent $4 billion a year over the course of the last 10 to 15 years on the European Reassurance Initiative. I'm not saying that was bad, but if you had split that in half during those 13 years and spent $2 billion of that on traditional military investment and $2 billion of that on helping Europe become energy disconnected from Russia, you would have avoided much of the pain that Europe has had to live through as it has had to disconnect itself under emergency circumstances. So I think part of our containment strategy has to be recasting the way in which we evaluate our mutual investment in mutual defense. Yes, we need more conventional military hardware. Yes, the invasion of Ukraine is a reminder that you need to be able to invest in hard defense of your territory. But there are lots of other ways that Russia asserts its influence, and we should measure our defensive capabilities against those techniques as well.
Thank you so much. We have time for a couple more questions. There's one here. Yeah, this gentleman here in the red tie, and then we'll come to this gentleman here.
Hello, Mr. Chris. Thank you very much for your inputs and sharing. I'm George from Georgia, Georgi Agirbaya, from German Marshall Fund Fellow, Thielen Fellow, and my question is about relating to the Georgia. At the same time, you know that we are protesting and defending our democracy and to make security as well. For the foreign agent law, which is a Russian-style law and will limit the civic freedom and media freedom and so on, and this will increase the Definitely, this passes the security issues, also one of the NATO partner countries like Georgia. So my question will be kind of complicated, not easy, because situation in my country is not that easy as well, especially for the civic activists and media and journalists and so on. How we can ensure that as a NATO partner country, Georgia comes closer for the next steps moving forward. At the same time, what's your reaction to the government which reintroduced this law after last year? And how to ensure that from the majority of the citizens demands Euro-Atlantic integration we have in the Constitution in our article, but at the same time government doesn't ally with it. So to give a US reactions, because we remember that some judges were sanctioned last year, so what could be reactions for this year about this foreign agent law, all the situation going in Georgia at the same time to engage more and more Georgia. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Well, there's great concern in the United States Senate about the situation in Georgia, the Democratic backsliding, the continued and increasingly impactful work of Russia to sell Georgians on a vision that does not include a future with the transatlantic alliance. I guess, to the extent that I have an answer relative to U.S. policy, I would revert to the answer I just gave. I think the United States has made a massive mistake, and I've been very vocal about this with my colleagues, in over-investing in conventional defense and underinvesting in the tools that are necessary in order to help the Georgians root out corruption and fight back against Russian propaganda. About 10 years ago, I wrote a law that established something called the Global Engagement Center. The Global Engagement Center is a capacity of the State Department that funds objective and independent media in countries like Georgia, funds truth-telling to try to root out false Russian narratives. That capacity has become deeply politicized in Congress because many Republicans, many supporters of President Trump have no interest in fighting Russian propaganda and think that anytime you are engaging in fighting misinformation, you are engaged in pushing back against conservative narratives, whether it be in the United States or globally. So the United States just has to do more to invest in the kind of capacities that can help the Georgian people stand up for democracy and fight corruption.
Thank you. And final question, gentleman here, yes.
Thank you. Kevin Barron from Politico. Senator Murphy, good to see you virtually. Sorry you couldn't make it. I am going to ask you to talk politics, but politics to policy, meaning the last week there have been lots of events between the exchange of fire in the Middle East and the vote coming up that may, some argue, lead to a better support for the Biden administration and for re-election in November. All the issues that you're talking about today, explain to this European audience, will they matter to American voters? Won't they? Which ones will? Which one might? And are things boding a little bit better for Biden the way that events are playing out the last week or so?
Thanks.
I think there's a real risk of dramatically overhyping the impact that global events will have on this election, whether it be what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening in Gaza. Yes, there is a very spirited, passionate debate in the United States about the U.S. policy towards Gaza. Yes, there are many Americans who care about Ukraine and many other Americans who wonder whether this is the right place to spend dollars. But this election is going to be dominated by domestic issues. This election is going to be dominated by the question of choice, reproductive freedom. It's going to be dominated by the question of which candidate really stands for investing power in the middle class versus continuing to feed riches to the elites. And this election is going to be about the health of American democracy. There's a real feeling that we may be at a precipice moment, and I think that was one of the things that allowed for Democrats to do much better in the 2022 midterms. So I think to the extent that Ukraine and Gaza matter in the election, it will be largely on the margins. And so I think in a conference like this, it's important to be grounded by the fact, like many European elections, the question of what happens outside your borders doesn't always have the biggest impact on the decisions of voters. I think that'll be true in 2024 here in the United States. And I think there's obviously a robust conversation about whether on the president's left there will be real backlash for his decision not to fundamentally break with the Netanyahu government. I think that is also probably overhyped. Not to say that there isn't some consequence there, but there is still a big, sizable share, high propensity older voters who support Israel and who would frankly abandon the president if he were to abandon the Netanyahu government. So I've made recommendations based not on politics, based on what I think is right, but if you just want to look at the question of Gaza and Israel through a political lens, it's a lose-lose dynamic for the president. That's just the truth of the matter.
Senator, that's all we've got time for. Thank you ever so much for your time and your insights. It's been great hearing from you, and good luck this weekend from everybody here in Brussels. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.